Did pirates bury their treasure? No. Yes. It depends on how you see it. Would a pirate dig a hole in the sand and put some money in there? Yes, sometimes. But he wouldn't keep it there for long. Henry Pittman described one incident in which a group of buccaneers buried their money in the sand rather than leaving it in their chests. This was to hide it from their companions, who would end up betraying them. So much for honor among thieves. This wasn't a huge amount of money, essentially just pocket change, and it wasn't supposed to be kept there for very long. But was there any instance of pirates burying a vast hoard of treasure, drawing a map with an X to mark the spot, then sailed off, leaving the treasure map for any fortunate adventurer to find? Well, no. Why would anyone do this? When a pirate got his treasure, he wanted to spend it. Part of the reason is that most of a pirate's treasure couldn't be buried and kept in the sand for a long while. Most of their treasure wasn't coins or jewels, but stuff like cloth or silk. Even more perishable goods like sugar, spices, chocolate, even slaves. These things had to be sold, almost immediately. Of course, pirates tried for grabbing jewels and coins whenever they could. The most common currency in the Caribbean were Spanish silver coins. Despite Spain's attempt to regulate trading, Spanish coinage became the de facto currency in all the colonies. That was due to rampant smuggling, and of course, piracy. Illegal coinage ultimately ended up in innocent hands. Still, if the Spanish Coast Guard found Spanish coins aboard your ship, they'd use it as a reason to plunder you, but they really just needed any reason. Spanish coins were mostly silver. They weighed 27 grams and were crude, irregular coins that came in a lot of shapes. You wouldn't find one like the other, and there were certainly no round, perfect discs. Part of the reason was due to a little bit of 17th century trolling, a technique called clipping. Some crafty people would literally clip away the edges of Spanish coins and then melt the clippings into new ones. There were also gold coins called doubloons or escudos. Whilst we imagined them as large things, they were usually crude and the size of a nickel. Of course, if a Spanish town was about to be attacked, the inhabitants would escape with their valuables, or bury them in iron chests or earthenware jars. Some Spaniards would have their slaves carry the treasure to a secluded area, force them to dig a hole, put the treasure inside, then kill the slave and bury them with the valuables. This is apparently the origin of the trope, where a skeleton points out the location of a pirate treasure. That being said, buccaneers always strive for taking towns by surprise, to prevent the Spanish from doing stuff like this. Pirates wanted both the treasure and the slave, after all. But back to the scenario of treasure and treasure maps. A pirate might want to bury his treasure for a long while, as a sort of safekeeping. A former pirate named John Plantain had declared himself the king of Ranter Bay on Madagascar. Plantain made his fortune by working as a mercenary for the local tribes and selling prisoners of war into slavery. When Plantain was out on campaign, he had his treasure concealed as a form of protection. We don't know how exactly, either buried or hid somewhere, and then only for a short while, before being moved when he was back home. Burying your treasure was pretty risky. The treasure might be discovered by accident or intention. No one has ever blamed treasure hunters for not trying, and since they're pretty schizo, the smallest noose of treasure will send them on an excavating rampage. You could invest your money, buy property, or just put it in a bank. The best way was probably to have friends or family members watch over the treasure, but many pirates were unmarried, which might be a reason why they preferred spending it. Many colonies also lacked banking institutions. Neither could I find any evidence of pirates buying jewelry as a form of investment. Some pirates even had a bank aboard their ship. Their funds were kept in the ship's cabin or between the decks, and managed by the quartermaster. Indeed, most pirates wouldn't have had the large, planet-sized treasures we see in a few movies. As soon as the pirates plundered a significant haul, they had the takings divided among them. Ordinary crewmen got one share, officers two. If the ship had investors, those also needed their share. A bit of money was saved away in a sort of healthcare system, where pirates maimed in service were given a retirement pay. The captain got only between 2 and 6 shares, so even pirate captains would be unable to haul around those massive treasure chests. And these were in fact quite uncommon. Most treasure chests were small, because despite the individual coins being smaller and uglier than we'd imagine, they were still heavy. The wooden chest itself wasn't lightweight either, and the silver alone in a Spanish treasure chest weighed almost 180 pounds. Neither was the money just splashing around freely, but kept stacked in linen bags. Only sometimes do we find chests of this size. In 1688, Charles May wrote, "In the great cabin was a large chest, so heavy that 5 or 6 men could be just draw it along the deck, full of pigs of silver, bags of pieces of 8, and some gold." Hauling around a chest of that size is bound to hurt your back, and most pirates weren't happy to do so. Even if they had slaves to do the work, they'd rather just spend their money as soon as they arrived in port. They brought fresh, fancy clothes before descending into the taverns. Here they blew the money on good food, alcohol, and women, the prices of everything continually rising with their presence. The rest was pissed away in the gambling halls, at games of billiard, dice, and cards. Fortunes were exchanged for debts. Of course, there are plenty of pirate myths regarding buried treasure, the most famous ones involving Captains Kidd and Levasseur. Those we will talk about next. Olivier Levasseur was a pirate, responsible for participating in history's most profitable pirate raid ever. In 1721, the pirates seized a Portuguese treasure ship, including a large golden cross, needing 3 men to carry, which Levasseur took as his own. The treasure was split evenly among the crew, each man earning around 50,000 pounds. We don't know what happened to the fiery cross of Goa. Either Levasseur sold it or had it melted down, or it was lost in what happened next. In 1724 he wrecked his ship, and most of the crew were slaughtered by natives. Levasseur and some 20 survivors escaped in nothing but their underwear. They had lost most of their treasure to the attackers, apart from some diamonds. By September of 1724, the pirates were pardoned by the governor of Ile de Bourbon, and Levasseur retired as a pilot on Madagascar. 6 years later, Levasseur was arrested by French officials and imprisoned on Ile de Bourbon. It's uncertain why. He was working as a pilot and had committed no acts of piracy since he was pardoned. The officer who arrested him spoke rather emotionally and angrily of Levasseur, even going so far as to insult his parents, so maybe there was a personal dispute? Others have suggested that it was a political move. The new governor wanted to mark an era of prosperity by hanging the last of the great pirates. Levasseur was offered no legal defense, and on the 7th of July, 1730, taken to the gallows and hanged. The popular legend says that Levasseur, standing upon the gallows dock, cast a large parchment into the crowds, crying, "To whoever solves this, discover my treasure." On the parchment was a cryptogram, which is allegedly this one I found on Wikipedia. I found no evidence of where this cryptogram originates from. It was most likely forged. The first problem is, where did Levasseur keep this parchment? According to court documents, he walked to the gallows in nothing but a nightshirt, carrying a torch in one hand. Some have suggested it was kept in a necklace, but how could a large parchment fit into something as small as a necklace? Secondly, most of Levasseur's treasure was taken by natives. What little remained, he either spent or used to set up a decent enough living situation. If he really was that rich, he wouldn't have worked as a pilot on Madagascar, guiding merchant ships around the local waters, Not the most exciting job, especially for an old pirate. He would have done like his fellow pirate captains, Richard Taylor and Edward Condon, who retired as a naval officer and merchant respectively. Still, the hunt for Levasseur's treasure continues. The parchment allegedly made by Levasseur has driven locals of the region to destroy their yards, blast boulders with dynamite, dig holes on others' private property, without finding anything. When digging around for the truth of these treasures, I asked myself, this video concerns pirates burying treasure, but did they ever hunt for treasure? Treasure hunters during the Golden Age would primarily search for the gold from shipwrecks, typically Spanish galleons lost in a storm. All of this gold was lost to the sea and had to be recovered by divers. But did the pirates ever search for treasure buried in the ground? They might have. Because just like our legends today, there were legends back then of buried treasure. And it drove people, even pirates, into wasting their lives away in fruitless hunts. One of these legends was recounted by the traveling priest, Jean-Baptiste Labat. He wrote something along the lines of the following. It is said that years ago a great Spanish galleon laden with treasure was wrecked on Anegada, and that the treasure was buried on the island. There it still remains, or so they say, because most of the men who buried it were lost at sea, and the few survivors did not know where the treasure was hidden, and were never able to find it. This treasure has caused many men, including several filibusters, to waste their time. I knew a man who stayed 4 or 5 months on the island, digging and sounding. He said that he found something, but no one has yet discovered the real treasure. Unfortunate. John Thomas Delane was a moderately successful pirate in the late 1720s. Interesting thing about him is that we have very vivid knowledge of what his pirate flag looked like. For the most part, we have only unreliable eyewitness descriptions of what pirate flags looked like. No actual pirate flags from the Golden Age have survived. The surviving examples we do have of pirate flags stem from the late 1700s and early 1800s, and they look pretty weird. We can assume that most pirate flags would have looked rather wonky compared to the depictions seen on Wikipedia. They were made by hand, after all, and even regular flags, like the Union Jack, were usually off-key in some regard, like the stripes being too thin or too thick. The icons on pirate flags would have been based on memory of seeing tombstones or funeral cards. Delane's flag was allegedly drawn by an eyewitness, and this illustration was later adapted into a woodcut, which you can see on screen right now. It was published in a period book. But yeah, this was basically a leftover from my video on pirate flags. In 1729, Delane and 10 of his pirates arrived in Nantes with a rich cargo of goods and money. While waiting for news regarding their pardons, they secretly sent their plunder ashore, just small bits at a time, and had it hidden. The French Admiralty knew something was up, and had their inspectors make a diligent search. The local priests even threatened to excommunicate anyone that supported the pirates. In spite of this, the inspectors were only able to find small parts of the treasure. Some of it was hidden away in the little cottage belonging to Delane's mother, another part in the lodging house of his girlfriend. The inspectors never figured out how much treasure there actually was, and again, we don't know if the pirates actually buried any of it. His mom probably kept it in a cookie jar, and his girlfriend in a suspiciously stained mattress, which the inspectors probably weren't liable to touch. Delane's crew kept much of their booty, and despite them spending a brief time in prison, they eventually received their pardon. Delane himself was not so lucky. They refused him amnesty, and we don't know if he was released or ended up in the darkest depths of a French prison. In spite, Delane's scheme seemed a more successful version of what William Kidd attempted in 1699. William Kidd is arguably one of the most recognizable pirate names, though some would dispute that he ever really was a pirate. His story is definitely convoluted, and for the purposes of this video, I can't get into it. Today, at least. You'll have to wait until next week. Hint hint. All you need to know for now is that he was hired as a privateer to hunt pirates and French shipping in the Indian Ocean. Political scheming and his own arrogance led to the government declaring him a pirate. He sought refuge in New York, where he enjoyed some political support. At this point, Kidd had divided his spoils amongst the crew, leaving him with a box of gold, 2 bags of silver, a bundle of quilts, 4 bales of goods, and a pound of gold dust. This treasure was worth £14,000 at the time, which is around $2.5 million today. This money was intended for bribes, a legal defense, and a desperate escape, if it came to that. Then he wanted some spare change to retire comfortably. Captain Kidd arrived at Garner's Island, named after its proprietor, Mr. Garner. Kidd asked Garner to safeguard his treasure for him. Later on, Garner would naturally try to save his own skin by claiming that he had totally no way of knowing Kidd was convicted of piracy, whilst simultaneously claiming that he had been threatened. Gossip spread incredibly quickly in this period, and it didn't take very long for everyone to know the rumor about buried treasure. The governor himself overheard one of Kidd's own crewmen speaking of it. A few years prior, the governor had actually been one of the investors in Captain Kidd's venture. He was now quite eager to just sweep all of that under the rug. He ordered Garner to surrender Kidd and the treasure, and Garner complied immediately. The governor seized the treasure, and Kidd was put in jail. But we don't actually know if Kidd's treasure was ever buried. Gardner probably just hid it somewhere in the house. A suspicious mattress, maybe. But by now it was too late. Rumors spread across New York, then the Americas, and then to London and Europe, that there was buried treasure on Gardner's Island. It would take a while for the myth of pirates' buried treasure to become a pop culture icon. It began in 1722 in a dungeon cell in Gujarat, India. An officer of the East India Company shared a cell with a Portuguese named Antony de Silvestro, who claimed he had been aboard one of the sloops that had hunted down and killed Blackbeard. De Silvestro told of an island near Maryland called Mulberry Island, where pirates had buried considerable sums of money in great chests clamped with iron plates. De Silvestro gave directions in great detail, including a mention of 5 trees near the location of the treasure. Of course, the officer knew that De Silvestro was pulling his chain, so to speak. There was no treasure. The officer's name was Clement Downing, and when his book was published in 1737, it was a great hit. The myth of pirates' buried treasure would continue for the rest of the century. In 1767, a play called Disappointment, or The Force of Credulity, made a mockery of those searching for easy riches. In this case, Blackbeard's buried treasure. The villains of the play create a hoax, including a document belonging to Blackbeard's imagined granddaughter, a treasure map, and a display of fireworks meant to be Blackbeard's ghost. In the 19th century, various authors would adopt the treasure hunting legend into their works. Pirates now buried Bibles to get the devil's protection, and pirates became associated with rampant superstition, ghosts, and sea monsters. Howard Pyle drew a fanciful painting of Captain Kidd burying his treasure, and the legend was finally cemented with Stevenson's Treasure Island. Huge thanks to my generous channel members and Patreon supporters. In particular, Cole Freer, Max Dweck, 1660, Michaela Jans, Daniel Stryker, Sea Dog, Randall DeVere, Old Man Said, and Krillov. If you'd like to interact with me or fellow pirate history enjoyers, please check out the link to our Discord server in the video description. Hope to see you there. Cheers!